After the Second World War, with the defeat of Germany and Japan, Cold War emerged with two blocks, a confrontation of America and the Soviet. Civil war broke out in China, and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government retreated to Taiwan. New China came into being and joined in the socialist bloc. In June 1950, erupted the Korean War, with China and America both got involved, and the two allies in the Second World War turned to be the enemies on the battlefield. With all these changes, U.S.-China policy changed from pro-Chiang, yet not against the communists, to full support to Chiang's civil war, from waiting the dust to ground to total breakup of Sino-U.S. relations. In retrospect of that period of history, that we can see how U.S.-China policy evolved and the different roles of all kinds of forces and factors, such as government agencies, Congress, news media, and public opinion, and the lobby. First, about the government agencies. In most cases, American foreign policy is made by President, State Secretary, and State Department. In Second World War, U.S. State Department had many China experts or China hands, such as the three Johns were mentioned before, like John Davis, John Service, and John Vincent. All of them submitted valued reports to U.S. government. Yet, all of them suffered bias and persecutions as communist sympathizers. Another high official in State Department, as Augur Hiss, was accused of espionage for the Soviet and was sentenced for 5 years in prison in name of perjury. And Richard Nixon got popular nationwide in America for this case. In February 1950, Republican Senator John McCarthy claimed the U.S. State Department had 205 communists in the employees, though the accusation was totally a fraud. Clarence Goss, a U.S. ambassador to China in Second World War, was recalled due to his criticism to Chiang Kai-shek. During 1944 to 1945, General Harley turned to the nationalists from being neutral. Stuart Layden, that having devoted to China's education for decades, and as the first president of Yanjing University, yet he was still a scapegoat for the failure of U.S.-China policy. He passed away in 1962, and his burned ashes were placed in Hangzhou, his birthplace, in 2008. From the military, General Stivell, commander in the theater of China, bomber in India, was called back to America at the end of 1944 for his bad relations with Chiang Kai-shek. The following generals like Whitmer, Hurley, and Paul Griffiths, the Assistant Defense Secretary, stood closer with Chiang. In 1947, even someone suggested MacArthur as an envoy to China for the commanding the Civil War. General Marshall, after peace mediation in China, came to be a U.S. State Secretary and Defense Secretary. Yet he was blamed by McCarthy as a communist sympathizer due to his neutrality in China affair. Second is the U.S. Congress. U.S. Congress is one branch of U.S. government for legislature, playing key roles in U.S. foreign policy. At that time, the chairman of U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee was Arthur Vandenberg and Thomas Connally. Both were conservative Republicans, hostile to the Soviet communism and supportive to Chiang's nationalists. The most notorious congressman was Senator William Knowland, a Republican from California. In 1952 election, presidential candidate Robert Taft and Eisenhower both considered him as a vice president, just one step from the White House. Later, Nixon became U.S. vice president, and Nixon and Nolan didn't get along very well, though they both were against communism. And Nixon called him as a bastard. In 1958, William Nolan failed in running for governor of California and then left U.S. politics, taking over his family business as editor and board director of the newspaper of Oakland Tribune. Continued his anti-communism in media. William Nolan was arrogant and stubborn, hard to work with, self-indulgent, in gambling and drunkard, divorced and borrowed $900,000 from the loan shark. He committed suicide in 1974 for being unable to pay off the debt. Another anti-communism congressman was House Representative Walter Judd. He had been doctor missionary twice to China and hoped China adapted to American model like a Christian country. For long, he had supported a nationalist and against communism. He didn't change his mind until Nixon visited China for better relations in 1972. The third is media. In 40s and 50s last centuries, the American had about more than 40 newspapers, mainly in New York, Washington, Chicago, and California, such as the populars like New York Times, New York Herald Tribune, Washington Post, and Christian Science Monitor, etc. Under the circumstances, basically they opposed communism and Red China, reviewing the U.S. foreign policy. And about 50 million Americans could read the newspaper every day. Meanwhile, Time magazine was the most influential one, and its creator was Henry Luce, with more than 2 million subscribers, and most of them are middle class and over. Henry Luce became a millionaire before he was 30 years old, and thanks to his publication magazines. In 1898, he was born in Dengzhou, Shandong Province, China, in a missionary family. He came back to America at the age of 15. After graduation from Yale University, he took a career in news media, and his experience and background in China made him focus on China affairs and with a sense of mission to change China based on American model. He paid more attention to Chiang Kai-shek and the ruling class, yet overlooked China's status quo and the true life of the ordinary people. He strongly opposed the authoritarian communism and believing Chiang Kai-shek as the future of China. So on his Time magazine, Chiang Kai-shek had been on the cover page for 6 times, and Henry Luce played very key roles in U.S.-China policy. Fourth is American public. Generally speaking, the ordinary Americans are seldom interested in the world outside America, and very few of Americans focused on the daily world news. Yet, under the noisy clamor of U.S. media, American public sometimes were misled and with fermented bias, which feed back into the media and formed as massive pressure and resulted in extreme conservatives in the Congress and the notorious McCarthyism that predominated in America. And the U.S.-China policy and Sino-U.S. relations deteriorated with these factors. Number 5 is lobbyists. A lobby is kind of a private organization to persuade government officials and congresspersons for some political purposes. And similar to Asian China's broker, mouthpiece, and current relationship or public relations. Its funds and expenses that come from the individuals, companies, or foreign governments. New York businessman Alfred Kohlberg, and was the chairman of ACPA, this American China Policy Association, and he was a stern supporter for Chiang Kai-shek. One of the major sponsors of this lobbyist were Song family that resided in America, and also Ambassador of Republic of China and Wellington Koo, who was the main representative of China to Paris Peace Conference after First World War, and endeavored to take back China's rights in Qingdao, Shandong, China from Japan, and refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles for Chinese interests. After getting back home, and he turned closer to the nationalist and was assigned as China's ambassador to America in July 1946. When China's civil war began to blow up, he worked hard to get U.S. economic and military assistance to the nationalists, and was regarded as a war criminal by Chinese communists. After 1949, he had mostly lived in America. Before his leaving ambassador, Chiang Kai-shek and asked him to get more support from U.S. government and the public opinion, promising him $5,000 monthly for lobbying and another $30,000 for special operation. He contacted widely with the U.S. government official and the congresspersons, especially those who held the antipathy to the communism and sympathy to the nationalists. His diplomacy and engagement in America helped in U.S. support for Chiang Kai-shek, and he paid $30,000 annually to an U.S. politician, William Goodwin, for lobbying in U.S. government and in Congress, resulting in 400 million U.S. China assistance to nationalists in 1948, which made public by Washington Post, and the deal came to its end. Wellington Koo also hired with high salary an ABC correspondent in the Far East, Norman Page, who advocated in U.S. media and including more than 190 tabloid newspapers to support Chiang Kai-shek, and even after his retreat to Taiwan. Wellington Koo also financially supported Emanuel Larson, U.S. State Department researcher in Far Eastern affairs, publishing magazine Far Eastern newsletters, and standing for the nationalists against the communism. Then the world changed fast and with uncertainty, and U.S.-China policy was shilly-shally, as Dean Acheson waited until the dust falls, which means when Taiwan was taken over and the total fiasco to the nationalists. Yet the outbreak of a Korean War came to be the last straw for the nationalists in Taiwan, for China and America fought face-to-face in Korea, and the enmity lasted for more than 20 years until Nixon's visit to China in 1972. Some people say Korean War had been ignited by Stalin on purpose, with Chinese involvement with the war, and to be hostile to America and holding China in the socialist bloc. Yeah, and reality, the relationship between China and the Soviet began to be sour in 1958, and until border clashes in 1969, with concurrently Sino-U.S. relations icebreaking. After the Second World War, U.S.-China policy had been under influences of various factors such as different voices in the government, confrontations in the Congress, opinions of the media, and the tendencies of the public, and also different interests of the lobbyists. 70 years passed, and today's U.S.-China policy still hinges on the 5 factors above: the government, Congress, media, public, and lobby, to which we can observe in Sino-U.S. relations and in world news. Here comes the end of today's program, and thank you for your watching, and see you next time. Thank you, bye.